Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I hope that's coming through clearly for you. Thank you for joining me and us, actually, because Marta's just through there as one of the panelists as well. So Marta will be answering any questions in the chat, that kind of thing. And we'll be sharing some links with you as we go. Let me just bring my microphone a little bit closer as we go as well. If you've got any issues with sound or anything, just let us know, pop it in the chat and we will sort that out for you, okay? Now, this afternoon session is all about interleaving, and it's a concept that's it kind of came to my attention about 18 months ago. And when I first sort of heard the term, it kind of caused a bit of confusion in me. I wasn't totally sure what it meant. It sounded like something really, really complex. You know, you have to switch around which order you teach things and how you do things. And so I did a bit of investigation into it, and pleasingly, I found that it was actually quite a simple concept, but actually really potentially beneficial. And in fact, and I've got the article here somewhere, there's a really interesting article amongst a few I've got here. And Marta, I wonder if you can post this into the chat for people to have a look at. That was done by the Chartered College of Teaching about the impact of interleaving. And basically, it's deemed to be really quite impacting and also cost effective. And I think that's a really, really important point. It's something you can implement quite quickly. Now, my objective for this afternoon is to really demystify and simplify what this interleaving thing is, and perhaps recognizing maybe even parts of your practice day where you already do it, and perhaps prompt and inspire, provoke some opportunities there might be to actually incorporate it into what you do going forward. So with that in mind, let us make a bit of a start. So I'm going to bring the canvas to you. So hopefully you guys can see the canvas. There should be some little picture of me. I'm going to be make sure I cover my bald spot up plenty as I'm doing this. But anyway, let's start thinking about this interleaving. And I want to initially bring you to what I would consider to be the main idea. And by the way, I should have said, Marta, if you could also post the link for the guys in the session tonight so they can access the images that, you know, the pre-produced images that I've got in the presentation here, that would be really great. They're on the links document I provided you. So what is the main idea of interleaving? Well, it's as follows. It is that right now, in the majority of scenarios in classrooms, in learning cycles, what's tending to happen is that students will study one thing at a time. Now that sounds really, really simple, and it might even sound desirable. It'll certainly sound familiar, I think. Students study one thing at a time. Okay, so this is perhaps the predominant way of doing things as they are now. And what we can describe this as is learning in blocks. Learning in blocks. Learning in blocks. Okay, now, again, nothing particularly wrong with that, I don't think. But what it leads us to is perhaps this notion over here of what we call blocking or blocked learning. So that is to say that if we think of all the activities and experience that make up idea A, that could be something that we teach and people practice and we do a worksheet for, they will be done in a block. We will teach A, we will practice A, we will test A, and then we will move on to B and later on C, D, E, and F, and so on. So the argument is that this is the predominant model. You could describe it as chronological. We learn things in a specific order. Now, what interleaving suggests is that that is not necessarily the best way to do things, okay? And what interleaving suggests is, and I just want to sort of simplify here, is to study, and I put it in inverted commas here, a few things at a time. Again, I don't think that's particularly groundbreaking, a few things at a time. Okay. So we would call it interleaving, and this is an important point. It's also the idea of mixing. You mix different topics, and skills, okay? Or it could be and or, I suppose. We mix different topics and skills together. And I'm going to talk about the nature of that specifically in a few minutes' time. And we call that interleaving. So just to be clear on that, how that might work, let's look at the block here. So let's look at our kind of A, B, C's here. It could be that we teach A, we teach B, we teach C, and then we practice A, B, and C together, okay? So we instruct on those three concepts, whatever they happen to be, and then we practice them together. perhaps we test them together. Consider these to be practices, reviews, worksheets, challenges, practicals, whatever it happens to be in the classroom for homework. But the whole idea is that rather than isolating an idea and just practicing it in isolation, we will effectively interleave those things together and practice, or learn them together and practice them together. And I think that is the quintessential heart of what this is. Now, it draws out, I think, a particular question. If I go all the way down here, we therefore need to ask the question, well, okay, fine. What is it that one can interleave and why might you want to do it? I'll come to the why point a little bit now and specifically in just a few moments' time. By the way, there's not going to be a ton of theory in this. I want to get onto some examples and discussion quite quickly. So I held myself back when I tried to answer this question of what can you interleave. I want to stress this is not exhaustive. Okay, this is not exhaustive. Some of you may be able to realize that as we talk about this, really quite big structures can be interleaved. If you think about the models which are primarily blocked in our schooling, it is things like timetabling, for example. Now, I'm not going to get into that debate here. I'll leave that maybe for, let's call it interleaving advanced or interleaving plus. We'll come to that when perhaps it's more relevant. In here, let's talk about teaching and learning our classroom today. So what can we interleave? We can interleave different topics. That should make perfect sense, okay? But this is critical. Those topics must have to some degree some similarity. If we, for example, I often use this as the example, if we happen to be a PE teacher and we're teaching A-level or BTEC or something like that in the theory classroom, and we've got 3 energy systems, what we tend to do is teach one, teach the other, and then sometime later, we might look at the sort of the recovery of those systems. Well, interleaving suggesting that from the start, learn them together. So that would be simultaneously learning the PC, the lactic acid system, and the aerobic system simultaneously. That's what interleaving would suggest. As an example, I'm going to give you another example from biology in a second. This is also important. If we are going to interleave topics, those topics not only should be similar, but they definitely shouldn't be abstract or aloof to one another. So I think I gave the example when I did the webinar on Tuesday. I said, we don't want to interleave, I don't know, we don't want to interleave the history of football and the abortion debate or something like that. Those things, they don't have any fit. They don't have any connection. Okay, so that is something we would avoid. We don't want to go abstract here. Now, March and I were discussing one specific occasion where abstraction can be helpful, but I'm not going to get into that within this context. And finally, and this could be considered to be a common mistake, this is not just about giving students more things at the same time. That would be considered multitasking. So as an example, we don't just, imagine that these 3 bits of paper I've got here, imagine that these are 3 different worksheets. Okay, let me just come back on the screen a second. Imagine that these are 3 different worksheets on 3 different concepts. It's not just a matter of giving the student those 3 together and saying, get on with it for 3 times longer. It's a matter of taking one worksheet or one resource and incorporating the 3 topics into that resource, okay, or into that experience, or into that teaching, or into that practice, or into that review. So they have to be merged. They have to be brought together. That's a really important point. Now, I will be giving you an example of this. A couple of additional points I wanted to make on this. I think this has some really critical advantages. Okay, what color should I choose? Let's choose dark blue. It's got some critical advantages. So the first one is that learners understand context better. Okay, context better, because effectively they are experiencing a broader range of things that can have some kind of comparison, overlap, difference, similarity. So the students should develop a contextual awareness of how that learning fits with other things, or indeed not. Okay. Secondly, it's specifically argued, and to a degree proven, that the learner will make stronger neural connections. Now, what we mean by that really is that their tendency to encode and retrieve this information smoothly from the long-term memory, rather than it sitting superficially in the short-term memory, is higher, which of course is a real positive for us. And I've really just mentioned this one already, but we get more retrieval from LTM. Now, I want to make a really specific point that actually addresses all of these. There's something else which I think is critically important in this conversation, and it is the idea of question analysis. Okay, question analysis. Well, I think one of the things as teachers we always feel like we have to do is like develop question analysis or exam technique with students. Well, just think about what perhaps one of the problems there that might be in our traditional structure. If we use a blocking method, let's say that, I don't know, let's say that the A is animal cells, just for argument's sake in biology, animal cells. Okay, and we teach animal cells, the students do a worksheet on animal cells, and then the students do a past paper question on animal cells. Well, in this block here, what's the chance of them having to think clearly and like really have to break down and analyze a question? Well, it's limited because there's no, as it were, there's no possibility that some other possible answer or set of information is going to answer that question. They can almost like relax. The brain can take the easier, well, this question is going to be about animal cells, isn't it? So I'll just write about animal cells. Whereas if we block things, sorry, if we interleave things, and let's say that this is our past paper question task here, and it's mixed in with others from slightly different topics with similarities, then the student has to analyze those questions with much more kind of active thought and active recall and contextual understanding. Now, I think that is a massive advantage to interleaving. Okay, so just go back to where we were. So we've got this idea of question analysis. We've also got the idea, and it's really important, that this also has disadvantages. So I'm going to put a disadvantage up here, okay, is that the learning, because we are mixing more learning together, it actually feels harder. Now, when you hear that, you might think, well, that's a negative, that's bad, the student finds it harder. But all of the research on interleaving effectively says the same thing, which is actually that is really good. It's what's described as a desirable difficulty. It causes more challenge for the learner, and therefore their tendency to engage with that learning and embed it is higher. Okay, so I just want to put that term in there. It's thought to bring about desirable difficulties, but when you first apply interleaving, maybe in a mini topic or something like that, you have to anticipate that students might go, oh, you know, this is tough, this is hard. And that would be normal, I think. So what we're saying here is that cognitive processing is ultimately good for the student, but in the moment will feel tougher for the student. And obviously, therefore, how we support that's important. Let's move on. Let's also look at old and new learning. I'm going to give you an example of this almost immediately. This is the idea, really, of Thalheimer's reaction curve. That's actually a typo. That actually should be reactivation. Apologies, guys. Reactivation. I should proofread, shouldn't I? That's the Thalheimer's reactivation curve, okay? And what we looked at on Tuesday in our practice and retrieval session was that reactivation through practice after the learning is a good idea. And what we're saying with interleaving is we can repeatedly practice things that we've learned before, interspersed, interleaved with things that we've just learned. So think about a practice environment or a review environment where we review what we've just done, but we review what we've done a week ago, a month ago, say. That would be borrowing Rosenshine structure. Okay, that is perhaps a way we can interleave. And the idea there is decreased forgetting. We get the advantage of spacing, which is learning over a longer period of time actually leads to less forgetting. And we get spaced repetition. Okay, so we get spaced repetition. The idea of spaced repetition is that it actually, of course, decreases that tendency to forget, increases the tendency to remember. And finally, guys, and I think this is where the great news is, we can also interleave the traditional structure with the interleave structure. And I've just called these, is my own term, blocks and leaves. So can I just say that, let's say you're going to teach, I don't know, you're going to teach 3 concepts that are relatively similar. And what you want to do is you do actually want to deliver the teaching in blocks. So you can do your first block, you can do your second block, and you can do your third block of teaching. But the point would then be that when you come to practice those things, I'm just trying to get the same colors. But when you do the practice of these things, what you would do is you would practice them together. Okay, so we would block the teaching. Look, there's block 1, there's block 2, but the practice would be one block for those 3 things. Perhaps the past paper question review, if that's an aspect of it, the worksheet work, it would be done in an interleave structure. Now, what I love about that last concept is it's quite easy to apply. You know, I can, and any of it really, you can say, right, okay, I've got these 3 things coming up. They're quite similar. I'll stick with the energy systems example. They're quite similar. The structure of them, the principles of them are quite similar, but there's contrasts. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach them separately, but the practice is going to be combined. And of course, what that's going to lead to in the learner is what is referred to as discriminative contrast, which sounds like a really negative social thing to get involved with in some ways, but discriminative contrast in the sense that when the student comes to practice those 3 energy systems, they're looking for differences because they're being practiced together simultaneously. And that forces the student not just to go, right, let me just write everything I know down about the aerobic system for argument's sake, or about mitochondria or whatever, but I've actually got to make sure it's specifically related to what the question's asking me. And that's called discriminative contrast, and it's increased by interleaving. I think that's quite a potent thing to reflect on. Okay, one last thing before I just sort of pause for a bit of discussion, and we are going to give some examples. Can I also stress to you, that we would describe this model as efficient? And what I mean by that is that there's no additional teaching or practice, but we are getting a better learning output. Okay, so we're not putting additional time into this. There's no additional learning time necessarily. They're still learning the same structures that would take approximately the same amount of time, but through combining them into the same experience, we get an efficiency because the learning output is greater. And with that in mind, I want to read something to you. Marta, if it might be a good idea at this point to share with our colleagues this article here, which is actually from an interestingly named site, from the Metal Learners, and it's called Interleaving, Changing the Way School Taught You to Learn. A bit provocative, but nevertheless, let's have a look at it. And I want to read a little part of this. This is based on a study that was done with what's called seventh graders in the US. And I'll go like this. The study involved teaching the students slope and graph problems. While the lectures remained almost identical, the worksheets that were handed out were different. 5 classes received worksheets based on interleaving, you know, like areas together, for slope problems, and based on blocked practice for graph problems. The other 4 classes received the opposite combination. The interleaved worksheets contained problems of different types mixed together, while the blocked ones had problems of the same type. Now, this is where it gets interesting. 5 days after the last lesson, all the students went through a review session. Then a surprise test was given 1 day or 1 month later. The results from the next day showed 25% better performance for the problems trained with interleaving. But this is where we should get excited. The results from the next month, so that monthly review, showed an amazing 76% advantage for the problems trained with interleaving versus the ones trained in block practice. So just to be clear, they were delivered to in exactly the same way, whether it was blocked or interleaved, these different, the control and experimental group. Well, I mean, they're effectively both, they're both experimental groups actually. But they were given different worksheets, some of which had interleaving for one section and another for the other section. And what they're saying is that after a month, the problems that the students experienced through an interleave practice were 76% more robust than those that were done in blocked practice. Now, I personally think that that is something worth getting quite excited about. And it's also, in my opinion, something that could be kind of delivered or achieved relatively quickly and efficiently. Marta, before we go into some examples, I'm going to have a sip of water and ask if there's anything you want me to clarify or any questions you want me to answer.
No, there aren't any. So far, there aren't any questions, but of course, we would like to invite all attendees to ask any questions or make any suggestions or any comments that they would like. I mean, I was just thinking that what you're saying is it's really interesting, and it makes me think about what opportunities this interleaving opens up, because I see it as an opportunity developing in students more analytic skills.
I agree.
The skills of comparing and analyzing are probably much more developed, and also the skill of defining something or describing something not only for what it is, but also for
But
what
it
it's
isn't.
not.
Exactly.
Which sometimes they might, it might help them if they get a bit stuck as what is, well, sometimes thinking of the opposite actually helps define something or describe something.
I'm going to look at an example of doing exactly that. Remember, a description of what something is can and perhaps should include what it's not, what it lacks, what it doesn't have, what it doesn't do, those sort of things. So I think, again, your point is a good one, Marta. If we as teachers are looking to develop skills in learners, and we want them to be comparative, we want them to be analytical, we want them to be evaluative, we have to give them contexts where those behaviors are not just encouraged, that they're not just desired, but they're implicit in the structures that we have. Okay, and I think interleaving is a good option. I would agree with you on those three: comparison, analysis, I would say evaluation as well. And I think the other one you said about description by spotting what it isn't as well as what it is also a really, really interesting one. And we're going to look at one of those in just a second. Now, I want to quickly show just one very simple way I could do interleaved practice. So I'm on the Everlearner here. I'm on an A-level course on physiology. I want my students to do some interleave practice. I go to an assignment. I'm going to create an assignment for my students. I want them to do some questions. I'll select my group. Yeah, I'm going to do that one. I'll select my course. I'm going to do physiology. And now I'm going to select what it is I'm going to interleave. Okay, so I've decided that what I want to interleave, I'm kind of just making this up a little bit, but we've just learned motor units, okay? And we've just learned action potential neurotransmitters. But you know what? Previously, we've learned types of contractions and roles of muscles, okay? And those things have a similarity to them. Conceptually, motor units and action potentials neurotransmitters are ultimately about how contraction of muscle tissue occurs. So I'm going to link that in. So this is the new learning. This is the old learning. And I'm going to set these guys some questions. So what I'm going to do, I don't know, I'll set some arbitrary pass rate, 75%. I'm just going to set 10 questions for them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the assignment for now. And I'm going to give them, I don't know, I'll give them until Monday at 4 p.m. for argument's sake. Okay. And I'll call it here. Let's be really specific. The students might not know if I wrote this, what it meant, but interleaved muscle contraction test. Okay. And I won't put any descriptions in here, but you could say whatever, repeat until you get a certain score. Good luck. You write whatever you want. I'm going to make it that the students can do retakes. I'm going to make it mandatory for my students. I could apply it just to some students, but actually I'm going to apply it to all of them. So that is a simple way of getting an interleaved practice. What I've interleaved there is I've taken some new recent learning and I've mixed it together with some previous learning. Now, again, those of you that were with us on Tuesday looking at practice and retrieval, you will already know the importance of things as I define them, as Rosenshine really defined them, of daily, weekly, and monthly review. And that, of course, fits neatly into this model of interleaving also. Interleaving through practice by incorporating that previous learning. Now, I think as educators, we all know that the more we can activate students to do stuff they've done in the past is a good thing, right? I don't think there's any rocket science in that. I don't think anyone will be surprised at that. How you do that, of course, is up to you. I've just shown you one mechanism in there. Now, what I do want to do is sorry, Martha, jump in.
Yeah, I was going to say, we've got a question from Alex Thompson. He's asking, just to clarify with an example with regard to GCSE physiology, block learning would be learning bones, muscles, movement, planes, and respiratory systems as separate entities. Interleaving would be learning specific sport movement with the relevant bones, muscles, etc. within each example.
And I think there's something in between as well, Alex. I mean, so just, I can't remember which exam board you guys are, so to treat this as a generalized response. But let's take your bones examples. Yes, you could look at it with, say, performers or movements in mind and somehow map out the entirety of that study. But just take, for example, the location of bones and the function of bones. Okay, I think that is very, very often taught. Here's where the bones are. label a diagram, do a couple of questions, whatever, whatever. Now let's look at the function of the skeleton, the function of bones. Well, maybe those things just very simply can be interleaved. So I don't even think it has to be like at the chapter level where you take a big topic like bones and a big topic like muscles and merge them. It could be at a very simple level. I take what is normally lesson 1 and 2 and study them in both lesson 1 and 2. That could be an interesting way of doing it. But equally, I don't disagree with your point. I think the key aspect of it is that you need to find where the contrast and similarity is reasonable enough for you to teach them together. Okay, so let's take that example. Learning that the ribs are part of the thoracic cavity or the wall of the thoracic cavity is useful if you then relate that to the function of protection, because all the stuff inside it is soft. Okay, that would seem like a nice similarity. But equally, you could be saying, look, it's sort of long and curled, but it's not a long bone like the humerus, which is there as part of the appendicular skeleton, really for leverage and movement, maybe some blood cell production and things as well. But you take my point. That, for me, is where we go. And I think what it comes down to is I think that there is an assumption in many cases, and I certainly don't think it's all, that we're going into a lesson to deliver a particular piece of content within a half an hour period or whatever it happens to be. And then the following session, we move on to something different. We've got to find the threads that run between them. And again, I would be confident that everyone in this call does aspects of this already to some degree. You know, when you're teaching, say, location of the bones, it's kind of hard not to mention functions in some ways. We're just making it explicit that we're going to try to. It's going to become part of our structure. But it's a great question, Alex. And I am right that you're at Epsom, right? I mentioned that last time, and I forgot to check after it. I'm pretty sure you are. You're good guys down there at Epsom. Now then, I want to jump back to the canvas for a second, if you allow me. This is my last little bit of theory and demo. I'm actually going to teach you guys something, so get yourselves ready. See if I actually do a half decent job. So let's look at an example, and look, you can kind of see where I'm going for it. We've got a sperm cell, and I don't know if I won't tell you what this other cell is just yet. I'll see if you guys can figure out, see if you can guess what type of cell that other one is. I'll give you a clue. Despite its shape, it's got nothing to do with sperm. Okay, so an example. This is really what I want to sort of get to here. I'm going to talk to you about specialized cells. Okay, specialized cells. And I know a bunch of you in here are PE teachers, but this is a bit of biology. It could have been anything. You guys will grasp it fine. You probably remember it from school. You might even teach it in your school, who knows. But we're going to do a specialized cells in animals and in plants. Now, the point I want to make here is I think it would be very predictable. In fact, I've done this many times in my career. It's very predictable that specialized animal cells would be separated from specialized plant cells and taught in different lessons, different blocks. Okay, we do the animal cells, we do sperm cells, neurons, muscle cells, and we'd sort of finish that experience. And then maybe next lesson we'd look at root hair cells, which is what this is, root hair cells, xylem vessels, and phloem in plants. We kind of separate them out and learn them as blocks. Okay, that's what traditionally would be most common. Now, I'm sure there's many biology teachers that haven't done that, but that would be the common assumed structure of how to do that. Okay, so what I want to do, and I should say, by the way, that what that would make our structure is it would make it, we would teach it A for animals, and I'll make it P for plants, and then we'd go P for plants. Now, what I'm going to do now is show you a model of where we would go A, P, A, P, A, P. And I tell you what, you judge me on whether I develop with the learner, I suppose. If I develop with the learner in the little bit of teaching I'm going to do I develop comparative analytical skills as well as the core teaching? Okay, so traditionally I would have taught sperm cells completely separate to plant cells because plants don't produce gametes, bluntly. But let's see if we can make it work together. Okay, so bear with me. Martha, do jump in if there's questions or clarifications that people want. You don't worry about disturbing my flow. And by the way,
someone has guessed what the other cell is.
Did they get it right?
Josh, yeah, Josh Gilby has.
Oh, Josh, you good. Yeah, show off. You show off. Good stuff. Okay, I should just stress, I'm only going to teach this first A and P section, this first bit of animal plan. We would carry on with something like nerve cells, xylem vessels in plants, muscle cells, phloem tissue in plants. Okay, so just be aware of that. So with that in mind, let's have a look at these specialized cells. Now, when we talk about the process specialization, guys, we are really interested in a notion of differentiation. And that is to say that, okay, we've studied generic animal cells and plant cells, but not all animal and plant cells are like that sort of big picture generic cells. They change, they differentiate, they become specialized. And the thing that I find interesting as a biology teacher is when they become specialized, their structure, what they look like, what they have, what's inside them, reflects what they do. And I want you to remember that. What they look like, what they have, what they don't have, reflects the job of that cell. So with that in mind, let's have a look at two examples. One is from animals, and you will probably recognize this as a sperm cell, and one is from plants. And you may not recognize this immediately, but this is a root hair cell, more of which in a few moments' time. So thing number one, what do we have here? Here and here, what do we have? We have a nucleus. We have a nucleus. So we've studied already that the role of nuclei, and particularly the DNA within them, is to control the activity of the cell. Well, that's equivalent in these cases, but this is where it gets interesting. In a plant cell nucleus, in a root hair cell nucleus, this one is going to have 100% of the plant's DNA. But in the sperm cell, the nucleus only has 50% of the human DNA. In human terms, there's 23 chromosomes rather than 46. Okay, quite interesting. So we have a distinction there. Let's move on. Let's look at shape for a second. With our sperm cell here, okay, we have what we describe as a streamline shape. Why? Because this sperm cell, this gamete, it has to swim, it has to go on a journey, it has to overcome resistance, it has to travel a long way. So that streamlining is really important. Now our plant cell, our root hair cell, remember that term, root hair cell, our root hair cell is actually quite blocky. It's sort of robust and chunky. And it has this hair-like structure here. We'd literally call this, by the way, here, the hair. Okay, in fact, let me be clear. This is actually called the root hair. Okay, now let's have a think about it. So we've got streamlining for this long swimming journey the sperm needs to do. What about this root hair structure in this root hair cell? Well, if I quickly show you this, perhaps you can start to see why this root hair cell has this long protrusion. So look, let's imagine that this is our root cell. This here is our root hair cell, just here, and there's its hair, and there's its block. So imagine we've got ours just there. Would you agree with me that the shape of this cell is what we would call having an increased surface area? Now, if we now think about the job of this cell, we've got swimming from the vagina to the ovum for the sperm cell, and for the root hair cell, its job is to have a greater surface area. Why? Because it takes in water by osmosis, and it also has to absorb mineral ions. Mineral ions, and I'll give you a little bit of future learning here, and it does that by a process called active transport, more of which another day. Okay, active transport. So the shape of our root hair cell represents its function, because you can imagine, right, if we could actually see the soil that was around this root hair cell, the blocks of soil, this root hair gives a greater surface area for absorption. One last point before we end this here. I want to draw attention to these blocks on the root hair here, 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 and here. And I want you it's much smaller, but I just want you to realize that in here, we've got like equivalent shapes. These are what we call mitochondria. Both of our cells have mitochondria. Now, if you reflect that mitochondria are the site of aerobic respirations in cells, Our sperm cell has got to go on that massive swimming journey to this huge ovum that it's got to get to eventually over here. And our root hair cell, it has to absorb these really large mineral ions. And both these cells require the transfer of lots of energy, and mitochondria do that job. They both have mitochondria for very different purposes. So back to where we were. I could kind of go on a little bit there and talk about the enzyme packet in the head of the sperm cell. I could say neither have got chloroplast. We could look at the permanent vacuole that's in plant cells and not in the sperm cell. You know, we could do all of that stuff. We just keep going for a few minutes more. But rather than boring you with that, the point I want to make is that what I've done there is I've put together two things that have similarities and contrasts, which are almost always taught separately. Now, my point to you would be, right, if we now gave those kids who took that teaching a worksheet, a quiz, and it contained questions on both of those things, what would it do to the active recall of the learner? Now, I would argue they would have to be much more switched on to be looking for those comparisons. The fact that they've also made those comparisons while taking the delivery, hopefully will help them to understand the context of those things. Look at the difference there. Right, I could go, sperm cells have mitochondria. Another day I could say, plant cells have mitochondria. But within that teaching, I'm saying, right, these have both got mitochondria. Why have they both? They're really different. So why have they both got them? Well, in the sperm's case, in the root hair cells case, it's bringing that context into the learner. And I think that is a really valuable way to think about it. Now, while I'm not expecting that anyone is, particularly, there may well not be anyone out here who's particularly interested in biology, but nevertheless, it's just an example. I just wanted to choose something that was a little bit contrasting. Oh, and we happen to be launching our biology and chemistry courses today. So that's also a nice feature. So I think that's really important. I want to almost read out this last bit. This is almost James's opinion. Martin and I have been talking about this a lot. We've been reading widely about interleaving. And this is what I think is a summary of why interleaving is relevant. It encourages comparison. It encourages context. It leads to more diverse practice. It causes slower spaced learning, which equals slower spaced forgetting. Okay, and that's really important. Go back to Thalheimer on that one if you're interested. It's more challenging, which equals, assuming it's supported and scaffolded, more encoding. It's more, you get more contrasting practice and test environments, and you get better question analysis by the learners because they can't allow their brains to take the easy route and just assume what it is that they're going to get asked about. Now, that to me is really exciting, and it's particularly exciting because it's almost a switch to actually, whether it's deliver or practice these things within the same experience. Can I repeat again? Please don't teach together. I would say the sperm cell and the plant cell were actually quite different. So that's like the level of like aloofness you want from the concepts. You don't want things that are utterly different because it becomes abstract. Now, abstraction can have a place, but not in a regular form structure. Okay, I'll put the brakes on there, Marta, and wonder if you've got any questions or points you want me to cover.
Yeah, there aren't any questions from any attendees, but when you were explaining this, I was also thinking that it's explaining things in this way. I see it as also as a more active activity on behalf of the student, because, I mean, for example, as you were explaining why, for example, the sperm cell has got this long flagellum or whatever that's for movement.
And say flagellum, it's a good word, that, isn't it? I should have taught that bit. Yeah.
I found myself thinking, right, and then in the case of the root hair cell, why does it, it must be to increase surface probably, because, so I find myself wondering and answering my own question, and then with that then being confirmed by the teacher when that comparison is made. Whilst if that contrast wasn't there, I would just be listening and learning that flagellum is there for movement. All right, so what? So I'm just taking things in without engaging. So without engaging so much.
And I would agree with that. I think I think the interleaving model, whilst I certainly wouldn't encourage it continuously or applying it to everything, it's a tool you can use to bring about a more contrasting and comparative experience in the teaching episode or the practice episode or the testing episode. It's funny, really, we're, as teachers, we're very comfortable with interleaving and testing, right? You know, we might do a past paper question on a single thing, but when it comes to, say, I don't know, an end of unit test or whatever, we're very comfortable with interleaving testing. The point would be, in that context, maybe interleaving at least part of either the delivery and or the practice would actually be quite useful for the students. I want to repeat that point again about the sort of desirable difficulty. If you do look to implement some of this, you may well find that the very first experience is quite challenging for the students. If they're used to Mr. Sims just telling them what they need to know and writing that down and then doing some practice, if that's what they're used to, this is going to be a more challenging experience temporarily, where they're going to have to sort of acclimatize to that, but it will be good for them. And let them know that in advance, right? Say, look, we're going to try something different today. You might find this challenging, but let's see where it takes us. That's good practice. You know, you're throwing experiments out. Do it low risk. You know, I don't think anyone here is encouraging you to go, right, here's my entire GCSE course, rip it up, I'm going to completely change the order. And I think what's concerning about interleaving is that's almost been how it's presented. It's like, I don't know if you had the same experience, maybe it's different for you. When I first came across interleaving, I was like, oh, wow, I've literally got to completely change my whole teaching structure. I don't think you need to take that kind of step. You could, but I think that's a massive leap in one go. I think baby steps, play with it a little bit, see what happens, introduce it as a practice tool. I think that's good. Can I just come back as well to the multitasking point? The point I made before, which was, don't just give them the same stuff all in one go and say, right, here you go. That's not interleaving, that's multitasking, that's different, okay? Interleaving specifically brings ideas together, all right, and then explores them, their similarities and their differences, their contrasts and their comparisons, their advantages, their strengths, and how they relate to one another, even if they're not directly related. Like, I mean, I don't think there's any relationship between, other than the structures and you know, the base biology. There's no relationship between mammalian sperm cells and root hair cells, not directly, but there are concepts that overlap within them. So I think that's interesting. Okay, any other points, Marta?
Just a question from Lee Regan. Must help. He's saying we must help with comparative long answer questions following the AOs.
Yeah, I mean, so I thought about whether I was going to say what I'm going to say now quite a bit, but come on, I'll just say it, right? So I think any kind of synopticity or synoptic skill is going to be aided by elements of interleaving. I think that is quite obvious, right? The tendency for students to be able to draw similarities and differences across their courses, maybe even across units of their courses, perhaps. I mean, a good question would be to ask an A-level PE teacher, would you consider teaching some physiology and psychology together? Maybe. Physiology and biomechanics together. Yeah, that feels comfortable. Certainly in, you know, you might teach something like, levers, joints, muscles, and bones together. Maybe it's quite possible. Would you teach sports psychology and sport history together? It feels a massive jump for very little gain, I think, for me, that one. So I'll bear that in mind. But I think one of the things that's interesting, I don't know how people feel about this, and I feel I'm going to say something controversial, but hey, what the hell. I've come across a lot of examples recently where students are being encouraged in, let's say, a 6 mark or a 9 mark or a 10 mark or a 20 mark, depending on your course. That, of course, they're broken down into AO1s, AOTs, and AO3s in terms of the credit that students get. And the students are being encouraged, now do AO1. There's the first block. Then do your AO2s, then do your AO3s. I think that's quite tough for the student, because it's taking the skill and very specifically blocking it. If you look at, say, an AO1 and an AO3 in a question, which might be describing and evaluating something, how can you evaluate something without describing it? They seem to be interconnected to me, okay? If we want to evaluate an energy system, just keep picking on that example, if I want to evaluate the aerobic system, I can't say an advantage is that, that it is a long duration energy system without describing it and saying it's a long duration energy system. I have to have that in, it has to construct the evaluative point. Or I can't say, I can't make an evaluative point that say that a disadvantage is a delay in oxygen delivery without saying that the aerobic system requires a delivery of oxygen, if you see what I mean. So for me, there's an interesting discussion to have there about whether we want students to separate out their skills in their answers, or whether we want descriptions to flow into comparisons, to flow into evaluations, if that's what's requested. Now, for me personally, that is a much more logical way of doing things, but obviously that's individual choice. Any other points, Marta?
No, there aren't any other points. No.
Well,
I think, everyone's very happy, basically.
well, you should be. No, I think, look, just as a summary, I don't think anyone needs to go and scrap what they do tomorrow, right? First of all, you probably look at it and go, actually, I did it the other day, right? The other day I did a bit of that, right? Or I do it all the time. I think what it is about having the concept in mind and going, asking a good question. Right, okay, so we've set it up that way. I've set it up so that I'm teaching block 1 in lesson 1, block 2 in lesson 2, block 3 in lesson 3. Can I play with that? Even if it's just the practice, even if it is, can I interleave what we've just learned, as we looked on Tuesday, with what we've learned previously? That is a beautiful question that interleaving could bring about. But can I stress to people, I really don't think the level should be, right, instead of having these things in a chronological order, I'm going to jumble them all up, or I'm going to do this block and then this block, and I'm going to reiterate my entire course. No, just experiment with it, see how the students respond to it, and go from there. I don't think anybody needs to scrap what they're doing to incorporate interleaving into their practice. I think it's about spotting opportunities and tweaking, and then maximizing because you've got that awareness and understanding of what its impact might be. I do want to draw a point from earlier. The chartered college argue it's amongst the most effective, cost-effective ways of improving learning in classrooms. Now, I think that's exciting. And then the article the study I read to you a few moments ago. The 3 studies I would recommend, Marge, can you pop them in? There's this one by Jonathan Firth. Jonathan, just in case you're in here or you see that, I'm sorry if this offends you, but I did find it quite a hard read, if I'm honest. But that's there if you want. That's not what I think I've grabbed the wrong bit of paper. There's this one, which is the Chartered College Teaching, which is the one I've referenced a few times. I would encourage you guys to have a read of that. Marge, if you can pop it in the chat, please. And the other one, which I personally found the most useful, was this one, Interleaving, Changing the Way School Taught You to Learn. Marta, if you can pop that into the chat. For me, this was the most useful one to sort of fully just grasp what this was all about. You know, like what is this thing? That for me was the significant one.
They're on the chat now. The first 2 that I had already posted them the first time you mentioned them, but now the last 3 messages are the 3. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Very, very final things for me. If you were involved in Tuesday, which I know many of you were, Alex, for example, Jamie, I know you were here with us, Lee, you were here with us on Tuesday as well. If you want to catch up with the recording of that, we've placed that on our YouTube channel, March. I think it's one of the links you have available. We could post it. But the YouTube video of Tuesday is available. The one of this session will be available probably end of tomorrow, something like that. Just bear in mind, I'm doing another interleaving session tonight at 7 o'clock. So if I feel that one goes better than this one, I might post that one to YouTube. So just in case you see some difference, we do 2 versions of the same show in a particular day, and whichever one goes more smoothly or I don't screw up so much, that's the one we tend to put out as a recorded version. So just be aware of it. It might be the 7 o'clock one. Guys, it's a real pleasure. I mentioned this on Tuesday, but I love doing this stuff. I do feel like I've been away for a while we've been grinding on the business side. But the more I do this in the last few days, the more I'm just going to keep doing it. I think we need to have these conversations. I don't mean to put me at the center of it, but maybe in the sector we're currently working in, maybe I'm the one who's got the most flexibility and time to be putting these things on. So I'm gonna keep going. If you've got things you would like covering, just message me and I'll have a look into it. Someone did that literally on last night. Sent me some say, have you had a look at this? Have you thought about covering someone? Just let me know what you think, and I'd love to. And and demos. You guys, the Everlearner. If you wanna jump on a demo with us, Marta will post the link in there. Come and do a demo of the website. If you want to interleave practice, if you want to use quizzing, if you want to be able to have your student, if you want to be able to have teaching as a review feature, sending students forward or back to take teaching, that's a great thing to come do. Many of you work with us already, but if you don't, have a look. We launched today biology and chemistry at GCSE. Before September, we will have all of the following: all of PE, biology, chemistry, French, Spanish, history, geography, computing, English literature, physics, possibly something else I've forgotten, but they're all going to be there. So spread the word. Thanks, guys. Have a beautiful evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care.